This is Kamera again. We're on day number 335, 1 Corinthians chapter 9 through 11. Paul addresses the fact that he is an apostle and his works speaks for him. He talks about the right to be supported by the people he preached to. He even says that the Lord ordered that those who preach the good news should be supported by those who benefit from it. But he says he and Barnabas, they support their own selves. He says, we shouldn't have to, but we do. We have the right to live with you, to eat, your meal, eat with you, your meals. He says, since we have planted spiritual seed among you, aren't we entitled to a harvest of physical food and drink? If they support other people, they don't support Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas, they work with their own hands. And Paul doesn't want to do anything to offend anyone that's going to cause them to think negative of the gospel. And so he feels good about working for his own self, supporting himself. But just know that the Lord do expect for those who benefit from the word, that they support those who deliver the word. Just to support, because it's all in the scriptures how and he spends more time on that subject. And it's not that people are working for, like Paul said, I'm working it because I'm compelled to preach the word of God. I can't stop if I wanted to. So he said he's a slave to the people. He said he's a slave to the people. I love the way he says that when he preaches to the Gentiles, he said he does not follow the Jewish law. He said he obeys the law of Christ. He says when he's with the weak people, he becomes weak. And he does all this so that he could draw them to Christ. Isn't it something? And he says that he is running a race and he disciplines himself like an athlete. Otherwise, he might be disqualified. He's talking about that word, delivering that word, preaching that word, standing that word. He disciplines himself. Because we are running a race. We are, guys. It's not given to the fast. It's not. Or the swift. Is given to those who endure. So Paul talks about, he used an example of the ancestors, and how when they were in the wilderness, they did everything together. They did the same thing. They followed the cloud together. They all followed Moses together. They drank together and all that. He says, but they didn't all please God. Isn't it something? Most of them did not please God. A lot of them fell dead in the wilderness. And he says they were our examples, so we don't imitate their evil deeds. When they served idols, when they disobeyed, when they grumbled, all that murmuring, complaining, all that negativity, they were our examples. He said 23,000 people died in one day. And he gives other examples, but they were our example. Those things that God did not appreciate, those things God did not like, they were our example. We need to learn from them. There's idol worship, there's murmuring, there's complaining, there's negativity. God is not a fan of those things. So we need to be careful. He says that we shouldn't test Christ. But look at this, guys. He says, if you think you are strong, be careful. I always tell people, it's a fine line. Doesn't matter how long you've been a follower of Christ, a believer of Christ. It's a fine line. Temptation is real. You have to stay focused. You have to keep that connection with the Lord. He says, excuse me. He says, if you think you are strong, be careful not to fail. Temptation in your life is no different than it is in others. He says God is faithful, and he will not allow the temptation in your life to be more than you can stand, and he will show you a way out. Isn't that something? So we have to make sure that like Jesus said, we need to be awake. Be alert, basically. We need to make sure that we don't enter into temptation. And temptation feels good, so we have to make sure we don't give into that sinful flesh. And we need to take that way out that God gives us. Once we overcome, we are free, we are good. But the hardest part is wanting to give into that temptation. Don't let it linger. Don't let it linger. As soon as you see yourself tempted, shut it down and get it right. It's real, guys. Temptation is real. And then he talks about eating food that's sacrificed to idols. Yeah, a lot of people feel that. See, God is the creator of all things and everything in it. And once you bless that food, that's between you and God. That's it. But if you know someone that something was sacrificed to an idol, I wouldn't eat it, honestly. Not that I care. Paul actually says, once you bless it, it is good food. You cannot eat at the Lord's table, because some people they were doing both. He says you cannot eat at the Lord's table and at the demon's table. He said, I am allowed to do anything. I am allowed to do anything. But everything is not beneficial. I love when he says that point, that when you bless that food, you're bringing God to your table. I absolutely love the way he say that. So we got to make sure that that we are. I'm not a believer of sacrificial offerings or whatever. I'm not a believer of that to idols or anything. But there are people who are. I wouldn't even eat it because people might see me eating and think it's okay, and they might think it's whatever. But I just wouldn't eat it. I'm not a believer of it, but then again, I'm also saying this is nothing. It's all fake. It's all phony. This food isn't gonna hurt me. I don't know. So you need to do. I like when Paul says, he says, don't be concerned. He says, don't be concerned for your own good, but for the good of others. So you have to be careful if you're eating those sacrificial. If you're doing something that is ungodly, I'll just put it like that. Anything ungodly, or someone around you, a weaker Christian or a believer, and they feel like it's ungodly, just avoid it altogether. Do it just because you want to show love to that person. He says, don't be concerned for your own good, but for the good of others. Paul says he doesn't do what is best for him, but what's best for others, so they may be saved. That is why he does it. He'd rather shut it down only because he's trying to save that soul. He doesn't want to be a stumbling block to them. He says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. He got a good point there. So Paul talks about the head of a woman. This part right here is very sensitive matter, but there is something that God has no respect of person, whether you're male or female. We're the ones with that problem, and then we have these different cultures and customs. And with the people of Corinth, they had certain customs, and even the Jewish people have certain customs. But check this out. Paul talks about the head of the woman and the head of the man and the head of Christ. And he says about the covering of the head when you worship and when you prophesy. He says, but this right here says it all. But among the Lord's people, women are not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman. But he tells them, he said, but you judge for yourselves. Isn't that something? You judge, because there are customs out there and culture that people follow. You judge for yourselves. But understand, God has no respect to a person. We're the ones who have that thing called pride and position. So Paul talks about the correct way of doing the Lord's Supper, because people were doing it all kind of ways that was just so all wrong. So make sure you read that. I'm sorry about that, guys. I am definitely fighting a cold, so I do apologize for all this. If we would examine ourselves, we would not be judged by God. Just keep that in mind. But make sure you read about that Lord's Supper. But I just want to end it with that. If we would examine ourselves, we would not be judged by God. And one of the things that I find myself doing is I ask God to show me myself, especially If sometimes we think we're some person that we're not, or we are presenting something that seem to be innocent, but it may not. So I'll just ask God to show myself. And sometimes I'll even ask other people their opinion of my presentation of a certain thing, just to make sure. And so there you have it, guys. Some good word in here. Make sure you read it. This is day number 335, 1 Corinthians chapter 9 through 11. You have a God-filled blessed day.